And since this is our first webinar in our autumn series on patient engagement that we're organizing, we really just want to thank you for coming. We're very happy to have you here. And with that, I want to introduce Liam Galvin. Liam's from the European Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, EUIPPF, where he is the treasurer. He's also the director of the Irish Lung Fibrosis Foundation, and he's going to kick us off with his view on registries. Liam?
Apologies for that. Now, I've been asked to just briefly describe the patient perspective of registries. Registries for patients, and more importantly to patient advocates and healthcare professionals of primary concern. Patients in the main have no idea what registries are, so our group as patient advocates like to explain to patients what benefits their contribution to registries can do for research, and also from a patient advocacy point of view, from lobbying for extra support and actually just knowing the number of patients with certain conditions or what support they need and various clinical details of patients.
Okay, Liam, can you share your screen?
Yes, good. So basically, we work within a rare disease area for IPF, and we've become involved with a project to set up the Ariane IPF registry across Europe. I've just shown you and they'll be sharing the slide anyway of the operational model. Now, the important thing to remember about Ariane and what we see as patients and patient advocates is the fact that we really need to involve all stakeholders. So that includes centres of excellence, like what the covered by the European Reference Network on rare respiratory disorders, scientists, researchers, academia, industry, also payers, and obviously the patients. So that we would be included on this triangle, the stakeholder board. The Ariane project has been headed up by the European Respiratory Society, and I've been involved with it since 2016. From a patient perspective, registries really are encouraged. We want to see registries set up across Europe or even at national level. For example, in my own country of Ireland, we have a very small, just started up registry on IPF, but at least now we've been able to confirm that there's at least 150 patients with IPF in Ireland. Before that, we knew there was more, and there are more than 150, but because of the disjointed nature of our health system, it's very hard. So that's, from a lobbying point of view, we can actually just, even basic numbers is very helpful for patient advocacy. But of course, registries are more important for research and the ability that researchers and clinicians can ask certain questions and get a large cohort of patient data sets together. So if we can move briefly to the next slide. The long-term vision of Ariane is that we would be able to spread registries from a European perspective across the globe, link up with other registries across the international scene. And we, as patients, will be able to contribute real-life data through patient-reported outcomes designed according to their needs and their research priorities. And also, once registries are set up, it would also allow the possibility of international biobanks. So the Ariane project is basically a model that we hope to follow in Europe, where that researchers, clinicians, and the various national registries would all come together alongside industry to really benefit patients through research and being able to share data across borders. So I think that basically explains Ariane. From a patient's perspective, we have no barriers to registries. Patients are very keen, especially among rare disease, to contribute towards registries. We have any number of patients willing to participate and provide data sets. So there are obviously the barriers are financial, also from getting the cooperation of individual registries become a meta-registry. So from the patient's perspective, there are no issues and no barriers, but from a clinical side and a working relationship with industry, there are some, but that will be explained later in the webinar. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Liam. It's nice to hear how the Ariane project is developing, and we look forward to hearing more about that. Next, I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Andreas Reimann, who will talk a bit more about how patient groups can unite and how industry can support that coming together so that registries can develop. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rob and Liam, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Actually, registries are very close to our heart because they help to produce evidence that may not be available at the time when a product is coming into the market, and helps, and that's very important, to gather patient-relevant data that helps further to develop the care management in many diseases, both rare and more common diseases. I have personally been involved in registries for many years. I worked first for the pharmaceutical industry, but then more than 12 years as the CEO of the German Cystic Fibrosis Association, and we were hosting a big registry, and I was also helping to build this up in Europe and later on in the field of rare diseases and in other diseases. I was involved in registries as well. So they are close to my heart, and it's so important what Liam said, that this is really a multi-stakeholder initiative comprising learned societies, comprising patients, obviously, also payers and pharmaceutical companies. With that, I switch off my video for the sake of quality, but quality of transmission. But just in case, I will switch it on later. Just see how this works. Apparently, the video won't go, so we just continue with that. Okay.
That's okay. We can't see you.
Yeah. This is now the situation we have often at the time of launch. We have a very limited bulk of evidence, especially in the rare disease areas. So we have preclinical data, and obviously the data from the clinical trials that were pivotal for the marketing authorization. But with the product being in the market, real life data is popping up, and that needs to be gathered in a structured way, not only for safety purposes, but also for the purpose of saying what the long-term effect of a product is. And it's certainly very helpful to gather the data also for a follow-up HTA, health technology assessment, that will probably follow after a first appraisal. And this involves, and this needs to involve all stakeholders in the, as I said, industry, patient organizations, learned societies, physicians. Now, unfortunately, traditionally, industry-driven product registries, and these were usually product registries, have a relatively poor inclusion rate, as suggested by this more recent publication from the group of Carla Jonker and Peter Moll from the Netherlands. And you see here registries that were imposed by the EMA. These are the number of registries. These are the registries, the single registries, and this is the number, the percentage of patients enrolled versus the predefined number. And as you can see, actually the most of the registries fall below their expectations. 3% were finalized, 71% are still ongoing, 26% had not enrolled any patients, 56% had only predefined sample size, and most of those who had were imposed registries, so registries that were ordered by the CHMP as part of the conditional approval. Now, looking to the situation in Germany, you may have heard about a new law coming into effect, or which came into effect actually in August this year, the so-called GSAV, which now makes it possible that the GBA, the Federal Joint Committee, imposes a registry as a post-marketing commitment or a post-pricing and reimbursement commitment to the pharmaceutical company. This is this section 35A of the Federal Social Code. And this project, in this process, patients are involved as a group with a voice but no vote. And it is particularly important that healthcare providers not participating in registries imposed by the GBA may not be able to issue reimbursed prescriptions in the future. So it's quite important to meet these obligations. The European Organization for Rare Diseases, EURORDIS, has set clear rules for registries, particularly in the field of rare diseases. They want to make sure that these registries produce meaningful data that is fostering further the development of the care system. This applies also to the cooperation with the European reference networks that are funded by the European Union. They aim at developing quality data collection in patient registries, and they really want to expand registries so they are not only providing epidemiological data, but also data that helps to understand the natural course of the disease and the treatment patterns. EURORDIS and their North American counterparts, Nord and Court, have developed 10 key principles for rare disease patient registries, and I don't want to go through all of them, just highlight 4. So rare disease patient registries should be centered on a disease or group of disease rather than on a therapeutic intervention. So clearly they are in favor of disease over product registries, and that's, by the way, also the clear statement of the EMA. And by the way, also of most of the HTA bodies, including the German GBA. A minimum set of common data elements should be consistently used in all rare disease patient registries, and I know that George will be talking about this idea in more detail. Rare disease patient registries should include data directly reported by patients along with data reported by healthcare professionals. So this is really an opportunity to include patient-reported outcome measures in the registry, and this mandates obviously also a kind of portal that helps patients to key in data directly. And they encourage very much public-private partnerships to make sure that rare disease patient registries are sustainable. Now, what are the critical elements of each patient registry? First, it's the governance. So that means you need to define what are the steering bodies, what are the decision-making bodies, and how can the different stakeholders, so patient organizations, HCPs, pharma companies, health insurances, public bodies participate. Who's owner of the data, who has access to the data, and who is to publish it. Of course, privacy and data security is mandatory. It goes without saying that the GDPR must be obliged, or must be applied, and there need to be a pseudonymization process in place that is really state to the art. The software, and George is going to talk about this in more detail, should allow to apply the so-called FAIR principles, and it should be interoperable. Finally, the data quality needs to be monitored. There should be a process for clarifying data queries and some external evaluation and certainly reporting. Now, I skipped apparently business model and sustainability, although this is really, really in the center. It's very, very important. So there must be a funding scheme, but we actually encourage that setup funding may come from industry, but should be later joined or followed even by fee-for-service models and charity grants. I'm not in favor of registries that are fully paid by industry, neither fully paid by charities. I really like the fee-for-service model, which means that you are paying for meaningful data, of course, data fully in compliance with GDPR, that helps private companies, but also public bodies to make better decisions. And as you can see, patient involvement is critical for most of these elements. Certainly for the governance, the privacy, data security, the data quality, but also, as I said, for the business model. Now, how to start when thinking about a registry from scratch on? Of course, you need to think about the population. Which are the patients you want to include? Where can you reach them? How many? Is there a sample size calculation, or you just take everybody coming in? What is the intervention, so to say? Are you comparing something, for instance, a product or a certain intervention, therapeutic intervention? What are the controls? Are these only historic controls, or is there also a cohort within the registry that is not treated with the intervention? And certainly, most importantly, what are the outcome measures? And here we really recommend to be agile, so to have a minimal data set that can later on be expanded to certain areas of the registry. And these are some examples of successful registries like the European Rare Kidney Disease Registry or the Cushing syndrome, or certainly the cystic fibrosis European registry, with more than 50,000 patients now in that registry. And there is a lot out there to help you if you want to set up a registry or try to join with other stakeholders, and especially the European Platform on Rare Diseases, but also the Orphanet Advice series. These are some other examples of registries you applying the federated registry approach George is talking about in a minute. So how to do this now in practical terms? First, if you want to address patients, if you want to include patients, create an online community, organize a kind of kick-off event, a conference or a meeting, whatever. Explore the creation of a European or international focused patient group. If there is none available, support them in gather, register that patient group legally and formally, and then apply the federated registry. So creating an online community means choose a platform that is meaningful to patients, address questions and address topics that are relevant to the patients, and start a dialogue with them. Secondly, organize a conference or a meeting, so just helping people coming together and discussing, like here with the spinal muscular atrophy community, discussing topics that are relevant to them, including obviously the participation in the registry. If there is now a European patient group, you may help and you may support patients in building such a group, it is certainly helpful to include also key opinion leaders, medical key opinion leaders, for a scientific board. When discussing the governance of the registry, it's important to clarify who is owning the data. I mean, the worst thing you can have, what can happen is that a single person, being it a KOL or also a patient representative, is just sitting on the data and not allowing access to anybody else. That's not helpful. Really helpful is to have a clear governance structure in place. And we certainly very much support the idea that the patient organization is the data owner, and on the basis of a fair governance structure. And then build the registry, applying the technology George is talking about in a minute. We very much are in favor of the federated registry idea, so having local or national registries with a minimum data set that can be easily pooled. What is now the role of industry? Industry can help to develop, or it should have actually a roadmap in place for engagement with patients in data collections. You can be, if you wish, a proactive leader to make sure that there is no fragmentation of registries. So in Europe, for instance, several registries in rare disease doesn't make a lot of sense. Certainly, industry should collaborate with researchers and patient organizations in the data collection and ensure that the information from registry is relevant to everybody. And there are different points of interest, certainly, when setting up such a registry. So it's completely okay if you have your own ideas in mind, for instance, meeting post-marketing approval, post-marketing commitments that need to be met. So we are always happy to help with this, to structure the patient dialogue and to bring the stakeholders, not only patients, but also the QLs and the industry together. And with that, I close and will be happy to take questions at the end of the session, and hand over to Rob.
Thanks everybody for joining today. I'll just try to rush through this. There's quite a few slides to get through, and hopefully you will find them very practical information. So what I've basically been involved in, I've had 30 years of marketing software, so I'm an IT guy by background, but for the last 7 or 8 years I've worked exclusively in rare disease design, for rare disease data collection. So I really have seen a lot of, let's call it, cold-face experience. So I think that will be very useful in seeing how the real world operates. I've worked with cystic fibrosis, EB, hemophilia. I've worked with large pharma companies such as Vertex, Biogen, and Shire. I worked for 2 software companies, Vitro and OpenApp, and helped them become leading IT players. I was also working very heavily with the European Commission on the European reference networks, and we actually ended up winning the contract for the CPMS for €5 million contract. So that's provided me a very good insight at the central stage of what's happening on the ERNs. And now I'm working as an independent consultant on multiple reg programs, vasculitis being a very interesting one, OI, and pulmonary fibrosis, which is what Liam was talking about earlier. So let's look at the challenges of registries. So let's figure out where we are going and what are some of the challenges. So why do we need registries? All registries, they're not the same. When you say, I have a registry, I don't need your help, that's that's not right. And then let's look at what are the main reasons that registries fail. So what we need with registries to understand natural history and best care pathway. What we're dealing with here is rare diseases. Rare diseases are short of clinical information. So we need registries to understand what happens to people with these rare diseases. We need to also help gain access to novel treatments. As we know from Andreas' discussion, the EMA and national payers are now moving more and more to require registries. These are expensive drugs that are being developed, and they want to make sure that they know as much as possible about the patients out there. So the other important thing that we see over and over again is the EMA may well approve a treatment, but then you find out that the HTA or the national payers say, well, I don't care. We don't have enough money to pay this. And the reason we're not going to pay for this drug is there isn't enough efficacy data to show it works in our patients, in our country. So we really need to be aware that there will be requirements for real-world data collection post-marketing approval. So let's be aware of that. Now, the other very interesting things too, when we talk about a federated registry approach, is registries can provide comparative benchmarking on patient outcomes across different countries. Put it simply, if you're in Poland and you want to get the Polish health authorities to invest more in healthcare for your rare disease, compare the outcomes of Polish patients to German patients, or to English patients or French patients. So this gives a lot of very good hardcore information that allows patient organizations to get more resources for their rare disease. Simply put, if it can be measured, it can be managed. So let's look at all registries not the same. So we've basically categorized registries into 3 different boxes. As Andreas was talking about, the epidemiological registry or the population registry. This is by far the most common type of registry. Very few registries actually get beyond this because it's fairly straightforward to do this. This is really just an Excel spreadsheet listing all the patients that have this particular disease, where they are and what type of variation of the disease they have. Going to level 2 is much more useful for industry, because what industry wants is they want to find out, well, what happens to patients with the disease? What happens over time? But this becomes a lot more difficult to put longitudinal data in there. So the simple compromise is to have an annual summary where you look at the progression of key quantitative elements, and you can see that progression over time. And this is a very good goal for registries to move from level 1 to level 2. Level 3 is where we say, fine, well, what we really want to try and do is record all data on that registry. So let's get multiple encounters. If the patient has multiple encounters per year, let's put that into the registry. And this is time consuming and costly. This is then becoming much more like a clinical trial or an observational study. The other thing to recognize too is registries are not black boxes like some kind of mysterious watch. They are a collection of decisions by stakeholders over what clinical data should be collected in a given geography. They are in fact somewhat similar to websites, and like websites, they evolve over time. Really, if you're talking about registries, you need to be prepared to roll your sleeve up, look at the data directory, look at the quality of the data, and stop treating them like black boxes. So let's look at some of the big challenges. The recurring challenge that I see over and over again, or let's call it a mistake, is that too many people are focused on the software platform and not enough on the surrounding issues that must be set up for a registry. They are persuaded, having been forced to develop a registry, they are easily misled by the promise of what I call cynically professorware, which is advanced technology offering things like big data analytics platforms and so forth, that really, in the case of rare disease, have little or no benefit. There are so many other issues around launching a registry beyond the software. Of course, we need software. Selecting the software platform is a little bit like selecting a crane if you're wanting to build an office block. It's essential, but you still need the experienced architect to design the office block. That's not the crane operator's job. Finally, what we're seeing is that most rare disease data sets are quite small. There's only a few thousand patients throughout Europe. They can easily be stored in a traditional database, and they can generate really useful data through simple queries. The main issue we find over and over again with registry data is that it's limited and that it's a lot of it is inaccurate. Okay, here's a few other things that we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the US Sunshine Act and the European Transfer of Value Act, which basically says that biopharma needs to not be involved directly in promoting patient organizations. There's an issue of bias there. The other thing to recognize from the patient organization perspective is it's not good enough to give the pharma a big fat report at the end of the year. They need anonymized data, because if they provide that report showing that patients in that country, the drug is working, then the payers will say, okay, we need to drill down on this. We need to look at the underlying data. So they need to have access to data. As I said before, national registries are often developed by doctorate students, unsupported open source solution, which they give to the patient organization once they complete their doctorate. This professor type ware is not sustainable. And what tends to happen then is if biopharma don't have a data collection roadmap, they tend to provide funding to registries where it's required rather than actually lead. Also, standard registries will not meet adverse events reporting, which is required under EMA. Without sustainable funding, you end up with registries that are patchy and erroneous. When market authorization is obtained, it's too late to provide the level of longitudinal data to provide the efficacy for HTAs. What this means is that payers will only agree to reimburse the small cohort of patients that are used to pass phase 3, that optimized cohort, and it's very hard to get the label extended to reimburse patients outside of that group. So let's look at what are our big goals. We know the problems now, but let's think about some of the goals. Okay, so we've used this concept of a common registry and real-world data collection platform. Let's not develop separate platforms that don't talk to each other. Let's go from the outset and develop a unified platform. And we see the European Federated Registry as a pragmatic solution to allow this. And then when you have this strategy of developing registries and an integrated data platform, then you communicate that with your stakeholders so they know what direction you are running in, and they know what funding they will receive from you if it falls within what you think is important in your long-term development of your treatment. And by having early engagement, you will increase the potential treatment population. Okay, so let's also clarify some issue here about when we're looking at a registry versus clinical trial. So this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but essentially registry data is cheap to collect, relatively speaking. It can be low quality. You can get a large cohort of patients because you're dependent upon patient goodwill to enter that data. Whereas a clinical trial is very expensive, and in rare disease space, it can be a tiny cohort of patients, maybe 50 patients. It's very high quality, and it has very strict protocol. So what we want to do is provide a platform where industry or anybody else who's interested in real-world data study can dial how far to the left or right they want that study to be, whether they want a very expensive, high-end study that will produce very high-quality data, or a lower study that's more reliant upon the goodwill of nurses and doctors to enter data. Okay, so let's look at our federated registry. What we're looking at here is a core model registry, which the industry will promote, which will allow national countries to launch a registry and to extend it to meet their local national requirements. That model registry will feed data through a minimum data set and through annual assessments to the federated registry. We also want to make sure that the federated registry supports other countries that don't use the model registry. Also then, we want a real-world data study, so the model registry can feed data into the real-world data collection platform so that biopharma can meet their obligations. So we end up with 4 different types of data. The minimum data set is fed into the European Federated Registry. We then have standard data sets such as patient identifiable information, such as date of birth, a name, and then we have unique extensions, which, for example, let's say Switzerland has requirements to record data that nobody else is interested in, so the Swiss researcher can add that without having to try and deal with a central central registry. And then finally, and very importantly, pharma will want to add extra data to meet their requirements for efficacy, but principally for safety data that the EMA will make conditional on their marketing approval. So we need to be able to have a platform that would allow pharma to collect this data very accurately and typically privately for a period of time, so that they have access to that data so they can provide that confidentially to EMA or any other authority. And then we have two types of data where it's either static or longitudinal. So let's look at how this works out in practice. So we have our model registry I referred to in the past, and this can also work on the international marketplace. So we look at how we might have multiple model registries working throughout the world. This works well in smaller countries where they do not have an established registry, and where you can extend it locally to meet local needs. And just while I'm on that subject, our main focus, of course, is Europe, but we have rare diseases where you want to have an international focus. And our general recommendation is that if you are dealing in the US, that you keep that data separate and in a HIPAA-compliant US server. And any European patients, of course, should be on a GDPR-compliant European server. However, researchers can share and have access to anonymized data, so they are not losing anything by having two separate hosting locations. So then we end up with what we all want, which is positive phase 3 results, at which point you need to roll out a real-world data study platform. So this is the brown section. And what this allows us to do is, if I just use my highlighter here for a moment, it allows us to select a cohort of patients. Sorry, I've gone one step forward there. So it allows us to select a cohort of patients and to extend that data by including a private extended data set. And that extended data will provide the necessary data that has been required under the EMA. That data will be supplied to the real-world data study. And in the event that it is a formal phase 4 study, you could employ a CRO to monitor the quality of that data and to verify then to the EMA that the data can be verified and is accurate. And that will then end up producing an anonymized data set, which is available to provide that real-world evidence that the pharma requires. Separate to this, either before or after, we can have a federated registry. And so automatically all the model national registries can share the minimum data set to the federated registry. What we then, of course, need to consider is what happens where we have existing registries that are well established. They must also be supported. These would typically be from larger countries such as France and the UK. What we want to make sure is that they are given the option to become members of the federated registry and provide minimum data using annual assessment to the federated registry platform. So the final view here is we have a fully developed federated registry which will meet the needs of industry and researchers for clinical data related to this disease. So what did biopharma get for this? They get a phase release. The important point there is the real message we're trying to get is make an investment pre-market authorization. What we want to try and do is create a model registry that, that the industry can back and promote to stakeholders internationally. They do not have to make a commitment to develop the more expensive and comprehensive real-world data platform until they receive positive market authorization. And that's the same with European Federated Registry, which can be developed separately. So biopharmas get access to an agreed anonymized federated data set with longitudinal outcomes. It also allows biopharma to communicate what their direction is, so everybody knows which fundings they will support and which they will not support. This is also not necessarily a solution for one industry. This can support multiple studies, and basically one of the biggest problems with registries is sustainability, especially if they are funded, say, by a public or a European foundation funding, is that they have a limited funding. So typically after 3 years, they all fall apart. But what we want to try and do is create an ongoing model here where biopharma is getting access to good quality data year after year and is paying for that. So this will make the sustainability much easier. Okay, this is not a fictitious model. This is something that I've developed together with Vertex and for the European Cystic Fibrosis Society several years ago, and we are doing that with several other clients at this moment today. So it is a model that works. So what does the research and patient organization get? They get a sustainable advanced registry for a minimal cost. The issue there is there might need to be some cost. That's to get around things like the Sunshine Act and the Transfer of Value Act that may require some minimal cost, but it will be a minimal investment compared to trying to run their own registries independently. Biopharma have access to anonymized data, but they will not influence the scientific direction. As Andrea says, the patient organization owns the data. The solution supports extensions for national data collections, so no one is trying to get everyone to use the exact same data set. The federated structure also supports existing registries, so we have a solution that works backwards as well as forwards. By having a patient portal, we're going to get a much higher level of engagement from end users. Using a third-party hosting company will mean that patient organizations do not have to cover all of the technical details with GDPR. The other issue I referred to earlier is benchmarking, where basically standards of care can be compared across countries. So how do we get there? Now we know where we want to go. Where do we start and how do we get there? Okay, and what I've said before and I say again is software is the easy bit. Getting multiple stakeholders aligned is challenging. You've got KOLs, industry, patient organizations, regulators. We use REDCap as a free and easy to use platform for prototyping in particular, and also then that could develop into full solution. We'll go into a little bit more about why we like REDCap in a minute. Also, what I want to try and outline is actually quantifiable steps that you can easily take to get a registry launched. Remember, however, that even if we promote a solution like REDCap, it's still just a crane, and you would never ask a crane driver to design an office block. So you need to have expertise such as our company or other companies who can provide that coalface experience in designing a registry. So let's look at REDCap and what it can deliver to us. So it's an open source solution, which we like a lot. It's been around for many, many years. The NIH funded it in the States. It's a rapid application development. That means it's possible to design the registry from a spreadsheet. We don't need to write a 50-page functional spec. We can easily and quickly develop the initial model registry. REDCap is used by thousands of researchers throughout the world. It's a very well established, so there's a lot of expertise in it. Because it is open source and used by many researchers, we're not dependent on any one development company or their particular proprietary code. Basically put, we're not going to run into a situation where if that company goes bankrupt, we can't do anything with the registry, or if they insist on increasing their daily support rate by tenfold, we're not going to be dependent upon them. We can transfer it to a third party. The REDCap can also be used as a final registry platform if we are happy with its performance and we're not really that worried about having a very nice state-of-the-art interface to the registry. Okay, and again, I stress the point that you need a system architect to design the registry. Just because you happen to find a student that has worked on REDCap in the past does not mean that they can design a registry. Okay, so let's look at how this works in practice. Well, I see it as being coming from a spreadsheet to a registry. So let's, some very, very simple things here. If we look at the input to a REDCap registry, you're going to look at columns. You're going to have field names, column 1, form names, column 2, column 4, you're going to have the type of field, column 5, a description. It's very straightforward, this. You're also going to be able to define drop-down options and change them easily. You can also define how to do calculations, in this case, how to calculate the body mass index and other things like this. So this is starting very simply. It can develop into a very comprehensive solution, but the great thing from the point of view of getting your project started is that this can quickly get going. So the alternative to REDCap, Rapid Application Development Platform, is 6 months agreeing to the 50-page specification with KOLs, 6 months to find and contract a vendor, 6 months for them to release the working solution, just to find out 18 months later that this does not meet the stakeholders' needs. Using REDCap, we can deliver a fully functioning registry within 6 to 12 weeks. Okay, so let's look at some details here. How do we get to launching the registry? So we've got 4 steps, and we've got some issues of ongoing cost and other services. So the first step is, let's design a data set from some closely related disease. That could be a KOL, whatever. Let's get that draft data set reviewed. So we want to make sure, for example, that we're collecting drug data properly. I recently looked at a registry where data was entered in 4 different forms for drug usage. That made it impossible to produce reports. So that's obviously not going to work. So we need to consider that. We also need to consider updating the registry to meet current standards. So we have to be respectful for GDPR in patient identifiable data. We have to look at ERN requirements. We have to support the JRC that have published, Joint Research Center, have published things on minimum data sets. We also want to look at patient self-registration, e-consent, these various issues, and coding to standards such as ORPHANET. Once we have got that, we've got a prototype, and that prototype registry can include a shared Excel spreadsheet, which allows all the stakeholders to add comments and suggestions to the registry in a dynamic way. What this then allows us to do is collect data sets from different existing registries and match them with the model registries. We want to then identify equivalent data fields, new data fields, and overlapping data fields. Obviously, overlapping data fields are the tricky ones, so we need to study those carefully. We need to also then, when we have engaged with the KOLs, we can then securely host the data and go live. We also need to consider things like ongoing costs. So that's things like who's going to enter data, who's going to manage centers, who's going to do reporting. So that has to be budgeted too. And also other services. We've looked at patient advocacy, but also the legal costs in setting up an umbrella patient organization. So finally, there's more details on our website under design, the design tab. So what's the take-home messages? Biopharma should lead. We need to develop an integrated real-world data and registry platform. By having a small investment early on, you're going to increase the target treatment population. And the Federated Registry is the solution to do that. REDCap, we believe, is the easiest way to do it. There may be others, but we think it's fantastic. The software is the easy part. Getting industry and everybody else to collaborate is much harder. Okay, finally, as a suggested update, this day week, we're going to be at the Eurordis Roundtable Conference in Barcelona. And if you want to have a further meeting, I'd be delighted to meet you. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynolds. That was a very interesting presentation and a lot of information packed in there. I've collected a few questions, which we'll go through now. Mr. Reynolds, you can stop sharing your screen, and do you want to turn your camera back on? And Liam, if you're still there too, can we see you? We had one question for Liam already, if he's there. Yeah, Liam, how is the Ariane project funded?
Ariane at the moment is just a tool, but it's a collaboration between the existing registries and with startup money from the DRS Central Research Committee. So obviously to bring it to widespread use, it would need funding or partnerships.
Great, thanks very much. Now maybe a question for Andreas. Andreas, during your presentation, you had a statistic about 9% of registries were mandated and 81% were voluntarily set up. Are these percentage, the person asking the question was surprised that 81% of those registries were voluntarily set up by pharma? Is that...
No, I probably, let me share this once more. That was probably a, I don't know whether I misspoke or it was a little bit too quick. Let me just share that with you. So that's list slides.
Yeah, we see yours.
Sorry.
That's the slide I believe they were talking about. Yep.
But now it's the wrong anyway, the information is that 30% were non-imposed and 61% were imposed registries.
Yes. Yeah, then I think and
if you look to the publication, the hatched columns are, and this is hard to see on the screen now, the hatched columns. Let me just try to use a different the other desktop, and that may be easier to see. Yeah, here we go. There are the hatched columns, and they are imposed, and the others are not. The green ones are disease registries, and the blue ones product registries. So that's what I said. What I was to say.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, a question for really any of the panelists, I think. Could you compare the efficacy of a drug given through a registry collecting real-world data? So could you find or compare efficacy of treatments by looking at a registry that collects real-world data?
Yeah, I can try and answer that. I mean, that's basically one of the core requirements of real-world data, is to try and compare different treatments in what people often call free-range humans. So one of the key requirements here is that the registry needs to be able to record drug data. So what you're typically looking at is there are drugs out there currently, and they're your candidate drug that will hopefully be safer or more effective than the alternatives. And what we want to try and do is collect that data in a manner that meets the requirements. And this can get quite demanding. The question here is whether you need to have, for the drug, you need to have start date, stop date, dosage, and what level of dosage requirement you need, how the drug is actually supplied. So there's a lot of details to it, but it has to be carefully thought out. And you also need to then think about the issue of collecting data outside. So what is practical from a doctor's perspective? They may be only able to say, okay, well, I know that the patient was on treatment from June to September, but I don't have the details of dosage. So we need to accept that at the registry level, the level of data that is collected may be less, but if you want to be able to provide detailed data to payers, you're going to have to do a study. And then you would select a cohort of patients, and then you would provide and pay for the collection of much more detailed drug dosage information.
If I may add, of course, registry data is inferior to RCTs when it comes to the evidence level, to the formal evidence level. That's no question. You have a couple of confounding factors, and you have a source of bias when setting up a real-world setting in a registry. However, if you do a prospective cohort study within the registry, so the registry is really the technology you're using, and then you define a prospective cohort receiving the intervention. It may be a new drug, or it may be a surgery, or whatever, or a medical device, and another cohort that is not receiving this. And you just observe. You may certainly get very valuable insights, and this is evidence that can be either supportive to your bulk of evidence you have already gathered, or answering questions that could not be answered by RCTs. For instance, very long follow-up is hard to catch with clinical trials. If you see, for instance, ATMPs, gene therapy, once-off treatment, how do you want to gather that information? And I think it's important to combine, I think, the classical RCT technology and registries. There are also cases in which a product comes to the market with a very immature bulk of evidence, because in a devastating disease, patients can't wait, and the marketing or the competent authorities, EMA or FDA, decide so. And this is then the time when registries could help to help additional data on efficacy and safety.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe a last question here for everyone. How can industry support European reference networks in relation to federate registries and what we were talking about today?
George.
Yeah, this is my baby. If I could just maybe if I just turn the screen on here for a second, let me do that.
Sure.
Let's just try that and make sure I get the right one.
We're just pulling up his slide. I just want to remind you that later on this week, you'll be getting the recording as well as hopefully the slides from everyone today. And those will be sent to your email as well as everyone else who registered for the webinar.
Okay, so basically what I've been involved in ERNs for several years, and one of the goals has obviously been that ERNs want to or hope to get funding with biopharma. But there are some problems here that we need to be realistic about. The first is that biopharmas need to, or they're a regulated industry, and they need to deal with industry. They need to basically get a contract with a legal entity. So they cannot provide funding unless they have a detailed contract with a legal entity. ERNs are not legal entities, and they're unlikely to become legal entities. So what we need to try and understand is that there are some real limitations here. One of the other issues, for example, is that under GDPR regulations, you need to have a data controller, and the data controller must have control access to patient data and must take responsibility for that access. Again, because the ERNs are not legal entities, they can't act as a data controller. So we have some serious problems here. Beyond that, we also have the fact that the controlling organization for ERNs, called the Board of Member States, they are taking the view that they do not want industry to invest directly to prevent bias. So what they have proposed is that industry should invest into a pool of funds, and then the Board of Member States would allocate that pool to different ERNs. And I've discussed this with many industry, and naturally they are saying this isn't acceptable to us. This does not represent a solution. The other problem, of course, is that ERNs are broadly focused on lots of rare diseases. So if you're an ERN lung, you've probably got 100 different diseases that fall into that category. When you're a pharma, you're only interested in one particular disease. So helping those other 99 diseases isn't going to help you reach your requirement to provide safety and efficacy data to EMA, and therefore is of little benefit to you. So we have problems. Now, having said that, what we also understand is that ERNs have solved a lot of problems. So they have done things like they've defined centers of excellence, they've defined things like interoperability, pseudonymization, and these are very important standards. So what we want to try and do is work with ERNs, but not directly invest in them. Okay, so what we see is that the key instrument for a biopharma going forward to handle a federated registry is to set up an umbrella patient organization, a European-wide umbrella patient organization that will have its members, the local patient organizations. That umbrella patient organization can then interface with the ERN. They're a legal entity and they're focused on a particular disease. So this is what pharma wants. And by collaborating through the local ERN through their EPAG, which is a patient representative structure that exists in ERNs, then you are in a position where pharma is investing in the umbrella patient organization, and that is supporting the ERNs.
Thanks very much. Yeah, great, George. I want to thank all of our panelists today for presenting, and also for everyone for attending. We will be having another webinar in November on patient engagement and successful clinical trial recruitment. So we look forward to seeing some of you back there, and have a good day wherever you are.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye, thanks.